Is your moral debt greater than mine? Have you ever wondered about your morality in relation to that of others? This is one of many of life's questions that Jesus addresses in his parables. A parable is a short story that can make a point about something, usually a truth about life, a moral question, and in Jesus' case, about who God is and how he interacts with us. Using parables to tell stories was a tradition in Jesus' time. But of all the parable teachers, he seems to have been the most active, using them a lot as part of his teaching. He liked to connect with people through examples that they would recognize in life. Jesus' stories always related to matters of everyday life for his Jewish Palestinian audience, whether it was about farming or shepherding, marriage ceremonies or community banquets. Like the best spiritual and moral teachers, Jesus illuminates timeless truth through the gritty situations of real life. Today, we might not be as familiar with the settings of Jesus' stories, so as we look into the context of the parable, I hope that in doing so, the meaning shines through, shedding light on our lives too. I hope you enjoy coming on this little journey with me back in time to what was then Roman-occupied Israel around 30 years AD to discover a man called Jesus and the stories he told. So this first parable that we're looking at is found in Luke's Gospel. The parable itself is short, however, the context into which Jesus tells the parable is fascinating. And as always, understanding who Jesus was speaking to and why sheds light on the meaning of the story. Luke's account begins by telling us that Jesus had received an invitation from a religious man called Simon, who was a Pharisee and teacher of the Jewish scriptures. And this invitation was to come back to his house and eat with him. Now, apart from the fact that Jesus was something of an enigma within the religious community at the time, there's nothing particularly unusual about this invite. It's true that Jesus was causing a bit of a stir in the towns and was teaching things that at times were directly challenging to the leaders of the religious communities. And yet he was still a rabbi and he was still teaching from the Torah, the Hebrew scriptures. It was customary at that time for religious men from the community like the Pharisees to hold special dinners called habarim, which would double as opportunities to hear a lesson from a particular teacher and discuss it late into the night. Apart from being fun occasions for those who enjoy a good philosophical chat, these dinners actually played a symbolic role in separating out the Pharisees from the rest of the community. The dinners were specifically for those who were ritually pure. Now, the concept of ritual purity is another subject for another time, but it's important to understand that it wasn't the case that ritual purity always equated to moral purity. However, it was the case that moral impurity did always equate to ritual impurity. Yes, a topic for another time though, so look up the Bible Project summary of Leviticus to understand a little bit more. So Jesus is invited to what it appears is a relatively formal elite dinner. The language implies it was a banquet even, for male-only leaders within the religious community. It's likely that he'd been invited as a special guest, as we said, to teach on something for the group to discuss later. While his lesson might not have taken the form that his hosts expected, in his characteristically subversive and pithy way, Jesus does exactly what he was invited to do. As I said, this is a relatively formal dinner, so picture something like Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, but with a lower table and people sitting on the floor. Now, it might seem at this point that Jesus was an honored guest as he'd received this special invitation, but we find out a few lines into Luke's account of the evening that that wasn't quite the case. Straight after being told that Jesus was invited to this dinner by Simon, a third person is mentioned, a woman, known in the city for being a sinner. Now, this pattern of three characters is often the basic outline for Jesus' parables, as we'll see going forward. In two short verses, we have a host, we have someone who's been invited, and we have someone who has not been invited. It's the appearance of this apparently uninvited guest who both precipitates this first short parable that Jesus tells and actually exemplifies in herself the lesson that Jesus teaches that night. A woman, this person known as a sinner in the city, enters the banquet after it had already started, uninvited. Now, on one level, this wouldn't have been very difficult in that, unlike our banquets these days that seem to have locked doors or bouncers, these banquets, while still invite-only, would have been held in publicly accessible places. But this perhaps goes away to explaining why it would have been even more difficult for this woman to enter. In a culture in which there were no doors needed to keep people out, we can only presume that the cultural mores were so strongly embedded that doors weren't necessary. People knew their place. But this woman evidently was different. And perhaps it was the person she approached that she knew to be different. In a place that she would not have ordinarily been welcomed, this woman boldly enters, walking through the taboos. She heads straight to Jesus. Jesus would have been sitting with his feet behind him, as is still the case in some parts of Middle Eastern culture today, with feet being regarded as dirty. The woman goes up behind him, in front of everyone, and kisses him. She kisses the one part of his body that ensures the kiss cannot be misrepresented, his feet. Tears flow from her eyes, and she uses these tears to wash his feet, drying his now wet feet with her hair. Lastly, she anoints him with oil. This woman would have worn a bottle of perfume around her neck under her clothes, a common item for a woman plying her trade. As she breaks it all over Jesus' feet, perhaps one thing this action seems to be communicating is, I don't need this anymore. I want my life to change. In any culture, an uninvited guest bursting into a formal dinner and expressing such open and deep emotion for the main guest would be shocking. But for us as modern-day readers, for this woman to be kissing and washing that guest's feet and to be pouring perfume onto him is something that needs a little more explanation. The reason for the dinner's interruption is never fully explained. However, we discover through Jesus' words how the woman's sudden attentive hospitality is the antithesis to that of Jesus' hosts. Where the woman kisses his feet, we find out that Jesus' hosts had failed to offer him the customary kiss of welcome in that culture. Most cultures have some sort of cultural norms that show courtesy to a guest, saying hello when you open the door, or inviting a guest to sit down, taking their jacket, offering them something to drink. At that time, it would have been customary for all the male members of the house to stand and wait for a rabbi to arrive and greet them with a kiss. Simon the host specifically calls Jesus rabbi when he refers to him as teacher, and yet he offers none of the customary hospitality. To forget to kiss someone in greeting in that culture, and still in some today, was either a signal that you deemed that person utterly beneath you, or that you held them in open contempt. This was no small oversight. In addition to the lack of care Simon shows toward Jesus, he also does not seem to have any care for the woman. He's concerned with his reputation. He knows that she's known in the town, and he sees her loose hair touching Jesus, and he immediately assumes that he knows and understands the situation. The Greek word that Simon uses for touching here is haptomai, and implies a sexual caress. He's already made up his mind about this woman. He's judged her, and he has made up his mind about Jesus too. We, the readers, know that something about Jesus has impacted this woman to lead her to act in this loving way towards him. But this doesn't seem to occur to Simon. Jesus understands her actions. Simon interprets them within a judgmental framework. Jesus tells us that God alone knows the heart of others. How often do religious communities make assumptions about people, what their actions mean, what their motives are? Like Simon, we might not be aware of previous interactions that person has already had with Jesus. It is into this context of incredible disdain from his host and an extravagant, culturally inappropriate expression of love from this woman that we find the parable Jesus tells that we're going to look at today. We'll start from verse 41. A moneylender had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they were unable to repay, he graciously forgave them both. So which of them will love him more? Simon answers Jesus' parable and says this, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. Jesus said to him, you have judged correctly. What is this parable about? Well, first it's about debt and it's about debtors. But what does the debt represent? Well, Jesus eventually explains that the debt in the parable refers to the sin that leaves all of us as people in God's debt. As in, God is the owner of everything. Therefore, any time that we sin, it's as if we've damaged something that is not ultimately our own, and therefore we are left in debt to the one who owned it. The Bible pictures sin in this way, as damage, something that hurts us, that hurts others, hurts our environment, as the one who made and loves us and others and our world the most. It hurts God. Jesus is bringing parity between the woman and the religious teacher. He agrees that one person has done things that has caused more harm than the other, and yet they are in the same category ultimately. They are both debtors, and they cannot repay what they owe, whether it is a lot or a little. This first point that Jesus is making becomes one of the cornerstones of the understanding of those who follow him and become Christians. that all of humanity are like these two debtors. All of us have been given our lives by the great owner of all things. And yet, whether in big ways or small ways, all of us have squandered what we have been given through causing harm in various ways. And yet, just like kids who could never repay their parents for a vase that they broke, none of us could ever repay God when we have caused harm. But the story goes on. The creditor knows that neither can make the repayment, and so he decides to forgive both the debtors, the one who owes a lot and the one who owes a little. Again, this aspect of the story, along with other elements of Jesus' life and teaching, go on to form a crucial part of Christian understanding of God, that God is forgiving. Now, Jesus goes on to expand on the nature of God's forgiveness and how it works in concert with his justice in later parables, which we'll look at. But for now, this simple point is being made to Simon the Pharisee. God forgives. But the problem for Simon is twofold. One, he doesn't want to think of himself as a sinner in need of much forgiveness. And two, he does not want to think of himself as in the same sort of category as this woman. He's above her. He is morally pure, whereas she is morally impure. But Jesus is challenging Simon's assessment. He goes on to explain to Simon that it is only when we have a view of our own sin that we can understand what it means for God to forgive us. And it is only when we experience being met with grace and forgiveness by God, or indeed by another person, that we can truly be known and loved. What Jesus is saying here is that a person cannot receive love while they are wrapped up in self-righteousness. This arrogance and contempt for others is actually a form of a barrier to receiving and giving love. Jesus then candidly points out that the ways in which Simon has shown disrespect to him, failing to greet him with a kiss, failing to offer for his feet to be washed, failing to anoint him with oil, and how in all these ways the woman has risked ridicule and mockery to show him that love and respect. In this story, Jesus faces down the powerful religious leaders and unequivocally stands with the person who they look down on. This is one of the aspects of Jesus that I've always loved. He associates with those the powerful despised, proud to call them his friends. And I would wager that this woman had already grasped who he was and that she was safe to know that he would stand by her in that moment. Jesus broke taboos on interactions with religious leaders. He called them out, happy to be rejected by them if needs be. Jesus showed solidarity with those considered outcasts. He was unafraid to talk about sin and the harm that it did to the sinner and the sinned against, but he did not equate sin with the need to experience shame. Instead, he taught that God's arms are wide open to forgive those who come to him. The parable that Jesus tells directly answers the question that Simon the Pharisee is struggling with. He thinks that this woman's moral debt is greater than his, and because of that he's superior both before others and before God. But Jesus' story tells us that we're never to assume this, and that no matter how moral we may seem outwardly, that God alone knows the heart of each. Jesus leaves us with a question not of our own morality in relation to others, but in relation to God. His parable encourages anyone who feels morally bankrupt that God's love and forgiveness is for them. And it challenges anyone who looks down on others to come before God themselves. This parable tells us that God's love and forgiveness is for everyone.
Hey guys, how you doing? It's me, Tom Cousins. Here's the OCCA studio. I'm actually part of an organisation called OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. We make films about the big questions of life and how the Christian message has valuable, we think, answers to those questions. If you enjoyed this film, please check out the other stuff on our channel and also consider liking and subscribing. It helps us make more stuff like this. Also, we want to hear your thoughts. If you've got any ideas for future content, please drop us a message in the comments or send us a direct email. Thanks go out to all the people that made this possible, including the lovely people behind me. Here's a fun fact for you. It takes about 60 hours to make each one of these films, and it's all made by our in-house OCCA staff who are funded by donations. So if you do have the means and you feel like it, please do donate. On our website, we've got a helpful button labeled donate, very easy to press. All right, God bless you guys. Bye.